Before we begin, a quick note on one of the cases discussed in this episode. This podcast was recorded in February 2025. The case of Dan Kumar Limbu and others versus Dyson was settled on the 26th of February 2026. The parties reached a settlement in recognition of the costs and benefits of resolving the case. The defendants denied all liability, and the settlement does not represent any admission of wrongdoing. The claim related to workers employed by a third-party supplier in Malaysia. Now, let's get into the episode. I'm Anthony Dunkley, a former UK detective, now international advisor investigating human trafficking and people smuggling. I spent years travelling the world, from conflict zones to corporate boardrooms, meeting the people on the front line of modern slavery. But now, the story comes home. I'm coming back to the UK. Because modern slavery isn't just happening out there, it's happening here, in our communities, our workplaces, and our everyday lives. Away from the headlines and policy debates, these are the moments that matter most. Real people, real work, real conversations. And the moments that keep them human. The small victories, the shared humour, and the strength to show up again tomorrow. This is the Let's Talk Modern Slavery podcast with me, Anthony Dunkley. Subscribe now and be a part of the conversation. Coming up in this week's episode of Let's Talk Modern Slavery. What kind of harm has been caused to people? And what kind of impact is happening on these individuals?
I've been involved in cases against some of the biggest British corporations, Shell, British American Tobacco, Dyson, extractive sectors, oil, mining. Their operations abroad have impacted local communities through oil pollution, through discharges of mine tailings into local communities' waters or land, experienced serious conditions of forced labour, retention of wages, retention of passports, lack of freedom of movement, not be able to get out of the factory compound, not be able to move around, no overtime, extremely long hours, no breaks, no days off. Working, every day of the month. A UK company can owe a duty of care to those that have been impacted by the operations of a subsidiary or even a third party that's within their supply chain.
Oliver, thank you so much for letting us come in today here at Lee Day, it's a law firm in London. I've done a bit of research. I've heard of Lee Day and the amazing things that they've been doing in terms of looking at corporate and human rights and how they converge in the cases you've been dealing for a long time. It's absolutely amazing. Give us a bit of background about yourself. How did you come to do what you do?
Sure, well, thanks very much for having me. So I've been at Lee Day for 15 years. I was attracted to Lee Day because of the work they do. As you said, we do a lot of work. We represent claimants. That's the primary thing, that we represent claimants only. And we try to provide decent legal advice to people who might otherwise not be able to afford it. And that includes people here in the UK and also people abroad. When I started at Lee Day, I came because I was attracted to the corporate accountability side of the work that Lee Day has been doing for 30 odd years.
Yeah.
And I've worked on a number of different cases across that time, both from an environmental perspective, so corporations impacting the environment, whether here or globally, and then also in relation to labour abuses or human rights abuses in supply chains. So that's where a UK corporation either indirectly has impacted people abroad or in the UK, or where a company within their supply chain, whether it's a subsidiary or whether it's another third party within the supply chain, in some way impacting people's lives, then we potentially can to bring legal action.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways I could sort of start, really, because it's such a huge thing but I mean, Lee Day is sort of known for one of those firms that really try and support the underdog.
Yeah.
It's those, like you say, who can't necessarily seek remediation or action necessarily the country they're in because those systems aren't there, or there's a whole host of obstacles. How does Lead go in or identify these cases and make these decisions about, do you know what, we're going to help support these people?
Yeah. So it's focusing primarily on the kind of international work, because obviously the domestic work, we represent claimants here. People come through the doors, they do for any other law firm. Obviously, if people are based somewhere in an African country, that would be much more difficult to find us. Sure. So we've obviously been doing this for a very long time. We have a number of different networks around different regions in the world. We work with lots of different NGOs and local community groups, grassroots NGOs, as well as the big kind of more international NGOs. And then we've become known for doing this kind of work. And they know that if an NGO knows if a community or an individual needs some legal help, then we may be able to assist. The way we look at it is the primary thing. There has to be some kind of UK corporate link. So if some harm has occurred, we are obviously English lawyers. We can bring litigation here in the English courts, and that's what we do. Yeah. There are some instances where we bring cases in other countries, such as South Africa. Primarily, our focus is bringing litigation here. And ultimately, it's about saying, well, if a UK corporation has impacted somebody's lives abroad, they should be held to the same standard they would if they'd done the same activity here, if they'd harmed people in the same way here. So that accountability needs to be all the way up the supply chain, all the way to the English courts.
So I know, there's been some big cases. Focusing on the cases that you've dealt with, Oliver, are we looking at what kind of harm has been caused to people? Is it through, obviously forced labour, those kind of things, sort of the working conditions, etc.? You mentioned environment. What kind of impact is happening on these individuals?
Yeah. All of the above. Yeah. Unfortunately, I wish that wasn't the case. So I've been involved in cases against some of the biggest British corporations: Shell, British American Tobacco, Dyson, and others. Traditionally, our work has been our international cases have been primarily against multinational corporations in the extractive sector, so oil, mining, where either their operations abroad have impacted local communities. So for example, in the Niger Delta, impacting people through oil pollution, which obviously can have a huge impact on their lives, through discharges of mine tailings into local communities' waters or land, where human rights abuses have been carried out by security forces that are related to mining operations.
So it's like a double whammy there. So
it could be, and it could be both. Yeah. And so a lot of our historic work at Lead A since probably the late 90s has been primarily in that sphere. And through that work, we've developed the law in terms of showing that parent companies, the company based in the UK, even if they have a subsidiary or a third party abroad that's part of their operations, parent company liability, the liability of that parent company in the UK has developed. And we've developed that through a lot of these cases against the extractive sector. And now we've got to a point where the law has crystallised in that way. And so basically, under various circumstances, a UK company can owe a duty of care to those that have been impacted by the operations of a subsidiary or even a third party that's within their supply chain. And that's meant that over the last 20 years, we've developed the law in that way, and it's led to much greater accountability for UK companies.
Yeah. I mean, you can have this image of the big corporate against the individual. And I'd imagine there's been, over 20 years and others, there's been a lot of kickback and resistance and for this law to develop. So, what problems, what obstacles have been faced, and what is the law that actually ties the parent company to the individual who might be well down the supply chain?
Well, so there was a particular case that came out and went to the Supreme Court. There were two, actually. One against Vedanta, which is a mining company that had operations in Zambia, and the allegations were that their operations had impacted the local communities through discharges of tailings, the offshoot of mining.
Yeah.
And then another case was against Shell, which was to do with oil pollution in the Niger Delta. Those two cases went to the Supreme Court. And they set out various criteria under which a company could owe a duty of care in what's called the tort of negligence, which is basically saying they've been negligent in the way that they've been operating. Yeah. They owed a duty of care to the people that have been impacted by their operations, and they've breached that duty of care by their negligence.
Yeah. So not necessarily under the criminal law at that point, but like under civil law.
Exactly. It's civil law. Obviously, they could also be breaching local legislation or even criminal legislation, and that's all kind of helpful in terms of illustrating the harm they've caused. But typically, it's the law of negligence because the company in the UK isn't necessarily captured by the laws of the local jurisdiction, say it's Zambia or whatever it is. But also, there are a number of criteria that the Supreme Court identified under which a company could be liable. But importantly, it was one of the kind of important parts of that judgment was that it was showing that even where companies are just holding themselves out as being a responsible company. So often you'll find in corporate materials, companies talk about their environment, ESG, environment, social governance, all of that kind of stuff. The annual reports where they set out their sustainability measures.
Well, we all see them. We see it all the websites and everything.
And what they say publicly, which is important because if what they're saying is publicly is correct and they are following through with the measures they say they are, then great. Then harm is unlikely to occur.
Yeah.
But if they are saying these things but actually not carrying them through, then they should be held accountable for the things they say they take responsibility for.
Is there a fraud in there as well? You know, saying that with.
I mean, that's kind of slightly so. I suppose you could have a kind of misleading element of that in terms of like shareholders. If a shareholder, has invested in a company on the basis that they hold themselves out as being green or whatever it is, then there is that kind of element. But really, it's all about whether they take responsibility for that area of their operations, and if harm has occurred, then they should be held responsible, really. Yeah. And that's what the English courts enable, and that is, I mean, in terms of that kind of accountability, the English courts are the most sort of further ahead out of any jurisdiction, even in Europe where they've got new directors that have come in. Yeah. We've been doing this for now 20 years, and we continue to develop the law without needing our own legislation, although obviously new legislation would be great, but our own legislation. Yeah. We've seen that through the recent Court of Appeal Dyson case that looked at these issues in particular.
Well, that probably ties in with something I was thinking of there. So with the Dyson case, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, that was basically there was kickback saying that, well, actually, the jurisdiction of which the case should be heard, not that it shouldn't be heard, but where it should be heard, because that involves workers, as I understand, Oliver, in Malaysia, I think.
Yeah.
And then, so how can a court decide that actually it should be dealt with in the UK? What was the understanding, or what stage are we at with that?
Yeah, sure. I can give you a bit of background on that. So the allegations in that case, our clients, we represent 23 clients and the family of one deceased worker. They all formerly were workers in a factory in Johor in Malaysia, making products for Dyson, your Hoovers, your hair dryers.
Yeah, Dyson, we all know Dyson.
Yeah, we know it well.
Household brand, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a few years before that, Dyson had moved a lot of its operations to Southeast Asia, to Malaysia, and this factory was producing a huge amount of Dyson products. Our clients were working in this factory, and their allegations are that they experienced serious conditions of forced labour, pretty much all of the forced labour indicators. So retention of wages, retention of passports, lack of freedom of movement, not be able to get out of the factory compound, not be able to move around, not being properly documented. So they were effectively there illegally, even though that was the responsibility of the factory. No overtime, extremely long hours, no breaks, no days off, working, every day of the month, et cetera, that all of these kind of key forced labour indicators that we look to when we're looking at cases of forced labour. Those are the allegations from our clients.
Are they drawn from the International Labour Organisation?
Yes, exactly. The internet. Yeah. So that's kind of, although we're not saying that that's law, that's how we assess whether a case is kind of
indicators.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that case, we were contacted by these people through a migrant rights activist. And that's how that case came to us. He said, "Look, I've been trying to help these people. I've been trying to help them locally. I've been trying to kind of appeal to Dyson about the allegations, but that hasn't been working." So he knew us, from previous work, and he came to us and said, "Look, can you do anything with this?" We looked at the case. The case currently is against 2 Dyson UK companies.
Right.
Dyson Technology Limited and Dyson Limited.
So this is part of a Dyson group kind of...
Yeah, so Dyson is not a publicly listed company like most of the multinational corporations are. It's a private company, so it doesn't have the kind of PLC thing, but these are the 2 primary companies that we say are related to the supply chain that goes to Malaysia.
Yeah.
So we initially started the action against them. Dyson then informed us that actually Dyson Malaysia is also involved in this. So we brought in the Dyson Malaysian company as well, and you can do that in the English courts. You can bring in a foreign subsidiary as a defendant if there's some link to the responsibility of what's happened.
Yeah.
And then Dyson challenged the jurisdiction of the English courts, which is obviously totally open to them to do. But it is something that we experience a lot. In our
smiling
work.
as you're saying this.
Yeah, I mean,
Tactic.
And it's, all tactics are fair game, but the tactics of defendants tends to be to delay proceedings as much as possible. And the first thing you can do as soon as you serve proceedings on the defendant, the first thing a defendant can do as soon as proceedings are served on them is to try and challenge the jurisdiction. Because then, obviously, if they're successful with that, then the case can't be heard here.
Yep. Human rights violations don't just live in headlines.
9 men were trafficked from the Czech Republic and forced to work at a UK McDonald's restaurant by a criminal gang.
They live in your supply chain. If your business isn't ready to detect them, you're exposing yourself reputationally, financially, and even legally. The Risk Ready series helps you get ahead of that. I'm Tony Dunkley, a former UK detective and international advisor on investigating human trafficking. I've worked around the world, from Africa to the Middle East, and I want to help you and your business become risk ready. The Risk Ready series is a 6-part live online training experience. It's packed with real-world cases, editable e-workbooks, and tools you can use straight away. If you work in procurement, HR, ESG, legal, or compliance, this training gives you the tools and confidence to act. Legislation is tightening. Supply chain scrutiny is rising. The question is not if, it's when. And when it comes, will you be ready? Join me live for the Risk Ready series on investigating human rights violations in supply chains. Sign up now. Take your team from vulnerable to risk ready.
So that's what they did. They were arguing these are events that took place in Malaysia. They're not Malaysia. Our clients aren't Malaysian. They are a mixture of Nepali and Bangladeshi migrant workers, but they're not English, is what they were saying. Yep. So they're not based here. Right. And it involves one Dyson Malaysian entity. We said in response, well, actually, the allegations are that it's Dyson UK that's responsible for the policies and guidance that and internal direction in relation to the recruitment of workers, migrant workers, the accommodation they stay in, the conditions they're in. All of these things, ultimately, we say went back to Dyson UK.
Yeah.
We also said that in Malaysia, whilst there's a fantastic legal system there and really good lawyers and really good courts, migrant workers are not able really to access those courts easily.
Cost and
and migrant workers don't have much status in Malaysia. Malaysia has a huge number of migrant workers that come to the UK. To Malaysia to work.
Yeah,
they're hugely reliant on it. Obviously, they have a big electronics industry, palm oil industry. All these industries are massively reliant on migrant workers. I think there's something like 3 or 4 million a year, but unfortunately, they don't get the status that they might they would have in their own country or what Malaysian residents have. So their ability to access courts, they're obviously paid not very well. Their ability to access lawyers, access courts, many of them are undocumented through no fault of their own. Yeah. So going to a court would obviously expose them to potential criminal proceedings against themselves. Yeah. So it's extremely difficult. Whereas for us here, we have obviously got many, many years of doing these kind of cases, so we could represent them here. And that's kind of what we were arguing. It would have been very difficult for our clients to access justice in Malaysia.
Yeah, is that the norm? Is that what would happen in countries where, for example, like you said, migrant labour will come into country A, which is outside of the UK, but work for a company, a recruitment agency, whatever it might be, in a factory in country A. However, how they're treated in that factory is ultimately, the liability of that, should I say, is ultimately on the parent company in the UK. But where does it come in terms of, is there the amount of tiers in the supply chain down? Is it, how do you link the two where, should they have known? Should they have made sure that their policies are integrated in that factory?
Yeah.
Is that where the liability is drawn to?
Yeah, so a lot of it will be drawn from the obviously policies and oversight that they have over the factory or whatever it is. Obviously, the further down, if there's 3 or 4 tiers, that potentially becomes more difficult.
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously with the Dyson case, that was primarily about a factory that was quite, was clearly in the sort of first tier below Dyson.
Yeah, yeah.
We have another case at the moment where we're representing Burmese migrant workers in a case against Tesco PLC.
Wow.
And Intertech, which is an auditor of Tesco, in relation to the garment industry. So our clients say that they experience extreme levels of forced labour in a factory in Mysot in Thailand, which is just near the Burmese border. And obviously at the moment with the situation in Myanmar with the civil war, many people are leaving. There's a real refugee crisis going on there, and the only work they can really get is in Mysot in the garment industry. Extremely vulnerable. Yeah, extremely vulnerable. And our clients alleged that they were working in a tier 1 factory that was making Tesco's own brand clothing, F&F jeans.
Yeah. So tier 1, they make the entire product basically, and they get shipped over.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They make the product. They were listed on Tesco's website as a tier 1 supplier. Yeah. Obviously making own brand clothing, and they between I think it was 2020 to 2023, they were working in the factory and they effectively weren't able to leave at all. They were living there in the most awful accommodation. They were working, some people were working 24 hours without a break and then straight back into work again. It was one of my clients had worked for 6 days without a break, without any sleep. A lot of their money being taken from them, they earned next to nothing.
Yeah.
And they ended up in 2023 basically leaving the factory en masse. It's the only way they could do it, really, get out en masse. And they've been working with some of the kind of NGOs locally and also with NGOs like Clean Clothes Campaign and Fair Labour and stuff like that. They've been working with those NGOs and they approached us and said, look, can you assist with this? Struggling again to find. Because the first solution should be to try and resolve things locally. If you can resolve it locally, great. But they weren't able to do that. So again, it came to us. And that case alleges that Tesco was, in 2017, was aware of red flags about the factory.
As recent as 2017?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they contracted with Intertech PLC, which does the auditing for a lot of brands around the world, a very big company. And they then failed to identify any other issues. And we say that was because the audit wasn't carried out properly.
Yeah.
Despite being to sort of set meter standards, the standards that a lot of brands say is the standard.
Yeah.
The audit was not done to the kind of standards that it should have been, we think.
Yeah.
And so they brought the case here, and we're currently going through that as well.
So just to untangle that, you've got parent company, Tesco.
Yeah.
Okay. And their tier one production for garments is in country, and again, I'll put it into country, irrespective of where it is, country B. You've then got an auditor who comes in and operates and conducts the audits on a international best practice standard provided by Senex, allegedly. And then, so they're ticking boxes, they supply this to Tesco, and then Tesco's think, okay, this is what it is. But in reality, what, according to your clients, about being kept up for days on end and all the other horrific things, those working conditions, how on earth could an auditor or others not have seen it?
Exactly.
And then because of that, obviously, the connection to the parent company, and they should have known or done more enhanced due diligence or whatever there might be. And that's the connection there, isn't it? So really, I mean, you've given two examples that, sort of probably will blow the average consumer's mind of, well, hang on, Tesco and Dyson, these are like family home, brands that we know and we've come to love over time. And it's unfair to just pick on them. It's because we're talking about these cases and they're current at the moment. Industry has its problems in all industries. How does the consumer so we can't trust what's on the website. We can't trust the policies and the statements that are made by the company. We can't trust the auditors. We can't trust the best practice standards that are being implemented, or if they are. How do we get to a position as a consumer, or what advice would you give to consumers? Yourself, to me, to anyone, of how do we really know what the truth is? How do we know that what we're eating, drinking, wearing, everything isn't connected to forced labour?
It's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
My wife often gets very annoyed with me when she goes out to buy some clothes or to buy some shopping, and I say, you can't buy that. Because it's really difficult. I mean, obviously we've got a lot of modern slavery issues here in the UK itself, but the biggest problem is globally, and it's in every supply chain you can imagine. Yeah. But I mean, I think, and there are obviously certification schemes and stuff like that. We've talked about fair trade and Rainforest Alliance and ethical trade initiative. All those things are obviously a helpful guide in terms of maybe saying, well, yes, there are some measures that are being put in place that may be beneficial to the workers. But even in those sort of situations, you also have some issues. So it is extremely difficult. But I mean, I think the way that I see it is that transparency is so important. If you are transparent, if a company is transparent about what's going on, and I think a company that says there's no forced labour in our supply chain, that's just not possible.
That's a red flag.
That's just not possible. A better response from a company would be, okay, fair enough. Yeah, we've got some issues of forced labour. We're trying to address them. We're taking these steps. But being transparent about it, I think that to me would immediately say, well, okay, this company is taking things seriously. Yeah. And I think that is such an important part of what, and something that we as lawyers are always saying and seeking in terms of you need to be transparent about what's actually happening. What are you doing about these issues? Not just shutting down and saying, oh no, God no, there's no forced labour in my supply chain. Yeah. Because most likely there is. Yeah. So I think that's the kind of key thing for me. And I think what we need to see here in the UK is if companies aren't going to voluntarily be transparent, then we need to see some new legislation coming in. And I hope that the new government that's currently in is going to be looking at that and improving on the Modern Slavery Act. Because when the Modern Slavery Act came out, it was seen as a beacon of hope and around the world. But I think now it's become outdated.
Yeah.
And there needs to be stronger legislation here. So that it does make companies who don't want to be transparent more open about what's going on.
Yeah, I think so. You talk about Modern Slavery Act back in 2015 that came through, wasn't it? And Section 54. So looking at its supply chain itself, I think companies that turn over more than 36 million with a UK office or a subsidiary within the UK are bound by that law. And I know that obviously recently with Europe and CSDD as well, where we're looking at, again, corporate due diligence.
Yeah.
And obviously we've got the Australia Muslim bill, we've got Forced Labour Act and such in the US, California transport. There's so many of these, these putting the onus back on companies. Are we going to see what will affect change? Is it companies being held to account from what yourself, and Lee Day are doing, putting their hand up as a separate thing? Is it the fact that the amount of pay or restitution, financial restitution, they have to shell out, and that the impact there is for the shareholders, so the shareholders' influence? What's going to have the biggest impact to change things, or is it a combination of things?
It's certainly a combination, yeah. I mean, obviously the Modern Slavery Act, Section 54, requires companies over a certain size to make a statement about what they're doing. But that's not really, I mean, it's very easy to make a statement.
We're not doing any, we're looking at it.
Yeah, we're looking at it. I mean, there's many things.
Yeah.
What we need to see is amendments to the Modern Slavery Act or a new piece of legislation that takes that further and says, well, no, you need to do more than that. You need to set out exactly what you're doing in relation to particular allegations, and you need to report on any allegations or issues that have been identified through your processes. Yeah. And then there needs to be some teeth to that. If you don't do those things, you could be in court. And I think that's really important. But litigation should always be the last resort. But currently it's the kind of the only real solution, because the Modern Slavery Act doesn't provide anything in terms of supply chains that actually holds a company to account for failing to adhere to. Yeah,
I think it's the injunction aspect, but I'm not aware of any company that's ever had an injunction put on there.
No, I mean, it's very hard, very difficult when talking about supply chains, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we think about what's happening in other countries, just bring it back to the UK. The US embargoed some of our products that have been produced in Leicester.
Yeah.
Again, pick on the garment industry, but that something was going on in Leicester.
Yeah.
And then our goods were seized under American Act in the US because of this link to forced labour. Yeah. So it's not just out there, is it? It's in the UK. It's everywhere where these things are happening. But I think what tends to be the common factor, and correct me if I'm wrong, is from what you're saying and what I've seen, is migrant labour, vulnerable people coming from conflict, coming from corruption, coming from all these kind of things, and just find themselves in a position where they either didn't know what was going to happen, or they were deceived as to what was going to happen. But when they get there, sometimes it's like, well, what else? What other options now do I have? I'm here and the situation is horrendous. Like forced labour conditions and everything. But what else do I do? Where do I go? I don't speak the language. I don't know where I am. I don't have an address. I moved around a lot. No money. It's incredibly difficult. And it's obviously an amazing thing and required that NGOs, non-government organisations, come in and are that local point of contact in order to make sure that they're aware of their rights in that country. And also what options there are to restitution and obviously coming through to lead at the end. You deal with a lot of these cases, and over your career have dealt with a lot of people who've suffered a lot. Something that I always ask, is how do you find that it's impacted on your mental health? And how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, I obviously... we experience distressing. We have clients who are in very vulnerable positions, and it's distressing to see what they go through. But I suppose really, for me, it's that I feel that I am able to do something. What I find most frustrating is if I read something about something in the papers that's nothing to do with my work. Yeah. And I feel so frustrated by that, but I can't do anything about it. And that's partly why I came to Lead Day, was I feel that I can do something about issues that I think are important. And I think that's probably what keeps me going and maybe protects my mental health, because I feel that I am moving forward and I am able to try and help these people and do something about it. And I think that is quite a powerful thing when you're talking about, mental health and being impacted by distressing things and stuff like that. I think that feeling of I am actually doing something that's going to help these people.
Well, Oliver, you're clearly doing a lot, as is everyone else at Lead Day. I wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating to hear from the inside about how these cases work and the corporate side of things and the due diligence. So I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone watching has as well. So Oliver, thank you so much for your time, and stay safe.
Thank you.